Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this session, which is about the circular economy for water. My name is Riku Vahala, and I'm working as a professor at Aalto University in Water and Environmental Engineering Research Group. As we all know, all water is recycled in our planet, and water is a good example of a resource which can be used several times. However, sometimes we have too much water, like during flooding events, and sometimes we don't have enough water. We have droughts, and we need to find other sources of water. And sometimes we have enough water, but the quality is not good enough for our purpose. Therefore, we need to manage our water resources. When we think about water and circular economy, it's not only about water management or about reuse of water. Water often contains valuable compounds such as nutrients, organic matter, and other compounds. It also contains often energy, which we can extract in hydropower stations, in anaerobic digesters, or, for example, in heat exchangers. Thus, from the engineering perspective, water and circular economy is about water, materials, and energy. Today, we are not only looking at the engineering perspective, but we are also going to talk about enablers. We have 5 prestigious speakers who are recognized experts in their field. But before I welcome our first speaker, I would like to encourage you to get familiar with our interactive question wall. I guess many of you are already familiar with it. You can send your questions to the speakers through this app. And we will deal with these questions, if the speakers keep their time, during the panel discussion, which will be immediately after the presentations. So, I have a pleasure to introduce our first speaker here, Dr. Thomas Michal. He's been president of a Brussels-based European Water Platform, WSSTP, since 2012. And WSSTP was originally launched by the European Commission and is nowadays recognized the voice and promoter of water-related research, development, and innovations in Europe. Thomas has a long experience in private water industry in several key positions. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be here, so thank you for having me. Does anybody know what that is on the screen? Year 2000, George Clooney, the perfect storm, right? And the perfect storm is what we get when we think about the fact that we need water for producing energy. We also need water to produce our food. Both are in increasing demand because the world population is growing and climate change is threatening all that. So in 2009, Sir Beddington in the UK claimed again this expression of the perfect storm to describe this nexus between water, energy, and food. So we've heard it since Monday. We are in front of a very serious crisis. This is not a minor problem we have to solve. This is a very, very serious issue that we have to somehow deal with it. And I will try to guide you in the little time available very quickly through what I understand are the major guidelines between water and circular economy. Now, if the UN Water is projecting for 2050 that we'll need 50% more water overall, how do you do that if the resource is finite? What can you do? Well, I believe there's about 6 strategies that can be deployed. The first strategy is quite obvious. That would be to take care of our environment, to take care of our existing natural water resources, to cherish them and deal with them properly. The second one is to save water, to use it efficiently, to recycle whenever we can. Be efficient. The third one would be to tap what we might call alternative water sources, such as desalted, brackish, or seawater. For these 3 strategies, that does exist, they are already available, technologies, water technologies, and maybe by the time of the roundtable, we can discuss whether we are able and willing to pay for them, but they are there. We don't have a technological problem to address these 3 strategies. There is another 4th strategy, which has to do, since we're talking about circular economy, which has to do with water banks in the form of storing water either in reservoirs or underground. Another one would be the concept of water transfers between regions, territories, watersheds, and a 6th strategy would be water markets, where we're actually transferring water or water rights between different water users at different times and in different conditions. And to implement these 3 latter strategies, we really need to add a 7th one, which is another word extensively used these last 2 days. We need to rethink water. And very especially, we need to rethink water governance. And this takes place at a local level, essentially. And I will start by talking about the urban environment, because the UN Water, again, is projecting that by 2050, almost 70% of the world population will be living in urban concentrations. So we need to look at this at the level of our homes, regarding things like grey water, whether we separate or not urine. We need to think about water availability in the cities for irrigation, for cleaning the streets and so on, reclaimed water. We need to think about industry, industrial reuse, and the use of reused water. We need to think about the wastewater treatment plant as another alternative resource. And if the farmland is not that far away from the city, and sometimes it is, then we also need think about the possibility of reusing urban water for agricultural irrigation. But there is also a more global view that we can apply to this, or a more holistic view, if you want, which has to do with climate change, of course, which has to do whether we talk about direct or indirect reuse, about recharge, as already mentioned, the relocation of water via storage or transfer, water markets, and virtual water. I will get to this towards the end of my presentation. Let us now look for 1 minute at the urban wastewater treatment plant, and we're going to show you 2 examples of what is happening there, looking at or looking towards circular economy. Accelerating the circular economy in the water sector by converting wastewater treatment plants into biofactories. 2 examples of that. I used to work for Suez, so I know these 2 examples quite well. That's the only reason that I've chosen those 2 ones. Okay? One is in my home country, in Spain, in Granada. It's not a small plant. It's a small plant that treats the wastewater of 300,000 inhabitant equivalents. It's quite significant. And that plant is already today, is energy sufficient, is recycling all the biosolids generated, is recycling the water for agricultural reuse, and is recovering even the sand and grit, which is filtered out at the beginning of the treatment train, washed, cleaned, and put back into construction works. So this plant is actually mentioned is featured in the European Circular Economy Stakeholders Platform as a success story. A second example was specially awarded at the Katowice COP, okay? And that one is in Chile. It's much, much larger. It serves a population of 6 million people. And this plant is amazing. I mean, this plant will be in 22 carbon neutral, energy positive. It's already energy neutral right now, and it will be zero waste. As of today, it is generating 49 gigawatts hour of electricity, 84 gigawatts hour of thermal energy, and 117 gigawatts hour of natural gas, a part of which is treated, used at the same plant, and the rest is injected into the grid. Now, this is possible in certain countries, in others it is not. And then this plant is also producing 137,000 tons of biosolids, of sludge, which after drying goes into agriculture as a fertilizer. But these two examples, as interesting and outstanding and state-of-the-art as they really are, we should be honest, they belong, and you probably all recognize the little scheme up there in the corner, they belong more to the reuse economy than really to the circular economy. The circular economy is something a little bit more. Regarding carbon, both of these plants rely on the fact that the biosolids generated will be put into the land as a fertilizer. And regarding carbon, they also rely on producing this sludge first by an anaerobic process, and so at the very end they are burning all the carbon to CO2. So what if we would put some anaerobic treatment in front of the treatment train and first harvest all the potential energy which there is in wastewater, and then we would depollute the rest of the water stream? The scheme would change completely. We would have a completely different system. What if the priority would be to produce some valuable monomers or polymers, instead of producing two molecules, CO2 and methane, which are the most oxidized and most reduced forms of carbon? Doesn't really make too much sense. It did make sense 50 years ago when the priority was, and only was, depollution. Regarding nitrogen, obviously both of these plants have some form of sophisticated nitrogen removal systems. But there is no system to recover this nitrogen in a more valuable form. What if we could produce valuable nitrogen-containing chemicals instead of blowing nitrogen gas into the atmosphere, which is what we do when we nitrify and denitrify? And regarding phosphorus, which is the other third important element, both of these have some sort of phosphorus reduction, but they have no struvite process or any alternative process for phosphate recovery. And this comes to show that change and management of big investment, long lifetime activities, assets, is a very complex issue. And designing and implementing these assets anew is even more complex, very expensive, and most of anything, it's a very slow process, because these type of assets are put in place to last for 50 or 100 years. For a full circular economy, and the case of struvite gives me a perfect point to make a comment on that, we need to look not only at the wastewater treatment plant itself, we need to look also at the outside boundary conditions of the wastewater treatment plant. Struvite is a perfectly valid and contrasted technology, but it's not applicable when there is chemical phosphate available at 1/10 of the price. So there is some regulation, some sort of legislation needed in order to change the business model. And then we need to really reach the right side of the scheme up there in the corner, to go really to the circular model. I think we need to take some of these global aspects that we have been discussing before, and we need to apply them to the local management practices. For example, we need to decide, we need to make a choice between direct or indirect water reuse, or both. What does each imply? Direct reuse implies that we treat all wastewater to drinking water standards. And that, as you can imagine, is kind of expensive to do. There's only one water quality then. That can then, that's the advantage, go through any piping mains. The alternative is to treat wastewater to a less important level and have indirect reuse for agriculture, for cleaning, for irrigation, what have you, even for recharge. But then, because of security reasons, you cannot use the same water mains, and that means you have to develop a second piping system, like they do in California, which has to have different color. That's why it is pink colored. Okay? And that is in itself a huge investment to do. So probably the answer is we need to consider both depending on where we are and what we're looking at. The second element we had was recharge into the aquifer, recharge into the ground. Because we do recharge into rivers and lakes and even into the ocean. We do that. But into the ground is very little done, it's very little used. There's a quality issue, there's clearly a quality issue because down there we really don't control so much things. So if we put something really naughty down there that we don't want to be in the water, getting it out of there later on can be impossible to very, very, very difficult. Okay? So there's a quality issue of what type of quality we can pump down there. There is a question also of ownership, because aquifers, they extend beyond political and regional borders, countries, etc., and are sometimes even not well understood. There is also a question of ownership between who pays for treating and pumping the water down, and who takes it out again. If it's all 100% public, you could say, well, it's no big issue. There is still the issue of long term, of taking a political decision today for water that might be taken out 20 years later. Some politicians would say, well, I have other priorities. Then there is the surface storage that we can contemplate. Surface storage is in the form of dams, obviously much more extensively used. Here the question is, what is the real priority when we build a dam? Is it our water policy? Is it harvesting electricity through hydropower? What is the priority? Are we really making sure that those priorities are right and straight? How many dams need to be built? How many basins do we construct? And how big do they have to be? The 3 gorges for everybody? I come from a country in Spain which, at the time of the Franco regime, which was not very democratic, made a lot of water dams, and today we're very happy to have those. So this is obviously quite controversial. Another thing which is very controversial is the water transfer and the potential water markets. Here, obviously, the issue of water pricing becomes the central element, and that is a controversial and highly political issue. And I'm not talking about public or private water management. It's the cost that we pay for water. And it's certainly a new paradigm, because if we still have today in Europe, not everywhere, but we have a problem with the full recovery of water treatment costs, the new paradigm is actually saying we should pay water for its cost of opportunity. Where I come from in Spain, in Murcia, the farmers say the most expensive water is the water you don't have. So, and last but not least, there is what we might call the virtual water, which has to do with what we produce and what we eat and drink, and the amount of water that directly or indirectly is needed to produce those products. And not only that, also where on the globe it is produced. So there is net countries which are net virtual water exporters, and there is countries which are net water importers. And so that needs to also be considered. So I'm coming towards the end. Water is the ultimate systems challenge. It really is. Doesn't say so WSTP or myself. The World Economic Forum says so. It's a unique resource which underpins all drivers of growth. Agriculture, our food, energy, industry, manufacturing, health and well-being, even leisure depends on water. Not only that, it forms a connecting center for all these different systems, and it is essential in that these systems are capable of balancing social development on the one hand and environmental interests on the other. A true circular economy, this is my key message to you, cannot be conceived without water in the center. 2 words about WSSTP. In order to respond to that, we have 4 strategies at WSSTP. One is to put water in the center, to really defend and promote the real value of water, not at its actual price, its value. The multiple waters for multiple users and users are essentially the philosophy behind going circular in the ways that I have described so far. We are absolutely convinced that digital will be an important enabler to this, not only because of low-cost sensor that will be able to tell us how much water we will have, where, and at what quality, but for example, blockchain can help us with the water transfers and the water markets. And last but not least, we also think that we have to better combine green, natural engineering with man-made gray engineering for more smart and better and more sustainable solutions. And with these 4 strategies, we have 3 specific objectives. To create a podium for water in Europe, which is what I'm doing right now here, at least I'm trying to. To promote excellent water research, which is something some of you have to do. We can only provide you the boundary conditions for that. And to promote living labs for water innovation, to really bring new water knowledge into the market. And because of the complexity of water, we believe the concept of living labs are ideally suited to do that exactly. For us also, true circular economy cannot be conceived without water in the center. This last slide is there to remind me to thank the organization and you all for having water in this 1 out of 16 sessions. I think it's very important, and hopefully we will have it later and sooner, or sooner than later, also in the plenary. Water in nature is 100% circular until man gets his hand on it. I think we can do better than that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for giving these wonderful examples about the real full-scale applications and possibilities of circular economy in wastewater management. Our next speaker is Miriam Otto. She's a senior economist in the International Water Management Institute in Sri Lanka, where she's leading a resource recovery and reuse research group. The International Water Management Institute is a non-profit organization, scientific research organization focusing on the sustainable use of water and land resources in developing countries. Miriam has worked over 15 years in the interface of sanitation, waste, agriculture, health, and environment. Miriam, the floor is yours.
So thank you, Riku. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here and to be part of this session. To follow up on the previous speaker who looked at circular economy in water from technology perspective, but also a developed country perspective, what I'm going to do is to highlight circular economy for water from a developing country perspective. I think we're all convinced of the benefits that we can accrue from integrating some of these principles in urban water management. But in many developing countries, we're still facing significant challenges. And to that, we really need to evaluate and see how we can develop innovative models that are not only sustainable, but that are really effective in us being able to close our urban water as well as our nutrient cycle loops. So this graphic is from the World Bank, which highlights some of the hotspots for water scarcity. And as you note from the graphic, the MENA region, as well as Southern Africa and South Asia, are some of the regions that are currently facing significant water scarcity, but also a decade from now, 2 decades from now, the situation is expected to worsen. If we take the example of South Africa, we all heard in the news how they're reaching their own, or they experienced a day zero, where Cape Town, the city was running out of water. And this was a significant wake-up call for those inhabitants or people living in Cape Town. But in many cities in Africa and in Asia, they face their own day zero quite frequently. Every season, every dry season, the cities run out of water, but also when their energy supply is rationed, and so the pumping stations do not work, and there is no water that flows through the taps. And so with these examples and that of Cape Town, it has really made us rethink water security and how we can no longer take it for granted. And we all know how circularity is key, or really the tenet of integrated urban water management. And as a previous speaker alluded to the fact that there are many innovative models. If we look on the left, intersectoral water trade, where we're looking at the potential for relocating water from freshwater, for example, used in agriculture, to higher value use in urban areas, but also treating wastewater for use for agricultural production. We can also consider simple models where the cities or their own downstream users, again, looking at how we can recharge our aquifers with treated wastewater. Beyond this, we know that we're not only treating wastewater, but there are, of course, significant potential to recover nutrients and energy. The technologies exist. From developed country contexts, these have reached scale, as was noted or highlighted by the previous speaker. However, a lot of these technologies are not applicable in developing countries, and when they are, unfortunately, they remain at the pilot level, and we're not able to effect the change that we're all looking for. And so in the case of Ghana, we really wanted to understand if we are going to integrate these circular economy concepts and principles into the way that we're managing water in our urban areas. It was important for us to move further up the value chain and actually look at the infrastructure that we currently have and really see the level of operation and whether it was actually covering and serving the population. So across all the region, based on the population, we noted that we did have sufficient number of treatment plants to manage the waste that was being generated. However, looking closely and trying to assess how many of them actually functioned before we took the steps towards circular economy, for the entire country, we have less than 10 wastewater treatment plants. And so this is what we have. The majority of the treatment plants are not functioning to capacity, and when they do, or oftentimes they don't at all. And you'd know that the majority of the waste that we're generating still goes into the environment untreated. And this is critical because it's great that we're talking about integrating circular economy guidelines into the way that we are drafting our next frameworks. But it's important that we understand that we are not going to function in silos. And so understanding the benefits it generates to the sanitation sector, but also the interlinkages and the implications that it will have when we're thinking about investing in some of these interventions. And so what we have is that we're still struggling to treat our wastewater because we don't have infrastructure or the capacity to ensure that these investments are sustainable. And we're still creating significant water pollution. When we talk about wastewater, we often only think about wastewater that flows through sewer systems. But in many developing countries, the majority of the population depends on on-site sanitation systems, septic tanks. If we take the case of India, 100 million septic tanks do not have receiving treatment plants. And so again, we go back to the challenge of environmental degradation. We do have circular economy-based interventions, and donors have invested, and we're seeing business growth in some parts of Africa as well as Asia. However, these continue to be characterized by subsidies. We don't see them being scaled up to have the impact that we're all working towards. We know that financing is a key challenge, but what remains in developing countries is business growth, really understanding business planning and our management strategies. Otherwise, we're going to remain at a pilot level and we won't be able to scale these up to effect change. And this is where we've talked about business, but really tangible business models that work. And of course, these not functioning in a vacuum, but really housed in the right enabling environment. And so my next couple of slides are going to highlight some models that have shown to actually be successful and have promised to be scaled up in developing countries to actually have impact. And we've already know this is a very common example where we're treating wastewater, it's being used in the agricultural sector. You can have a different constellation, whether it's a public-private partnership, or public entity or private entity that manages the treatment of the water. And this is sold to farmers and their benefits to households and so forth. The main element of this model is we're not only generating benefits to the agricultural sector, but we really want to reduce the cost for operation and maintenance, the burden that is borne by municipalities. Because in many developing countries, they simply do not have the budgetary allocation to cover the cost. And so with a model like this, we've known it to be very successful in the MENA region, where we're generating revenues to cover the operation and maintenance costs, but we're seeing significant benefits to farmers as well. And this has to happen with very clear institutional responsibilities and regulatory support. But as we have noted, if they're not if there are alternative water sources, then the issue comes to what is the market demand. And again, going back to pricing, if fresh water is priced lower than treated wastewater, then we know that there is no willingness to pay and there won't be a market. And so this example really shows the potential that circular economy has for the sanitation sector, but also the benefits that it generates beyond that. Looking beyond just agriculture or irrigation, but looking at how we can leapfrog the value chain in treating wastewater for aquaculture production. And here we've seen cases in Africa and Asia where they're not only recovering their costs, they're breaking even, and some of them are actually generating revenue. And so from that perspective, similarly, ensuring that there are very clear benefit-sharing mechanisms between the entity that either manages and operates the plants to the people that own the assets. With treating wastewater for aquaculture, for example, potential for full cost recovery, but there are resource constraints that we have to keep in mind. And this relates to, again, when we are transplanting technical solutions or business models into the developing country context. Related to land, for example, where we really have to think about what technologies work. And with aquaculture, we have to not only look at occupational health risks, but also the consumer from the consumer perspective and ensuring that we're implementing health safety protocols. This is a model that is emerging, intersectoral water trade, again, where we're looking at how we can relocate water for different uses and ensuring that we're matching the uses to the water quality. And this has been successful where we're seeing that is a year-round deficit of water and where farmers are able to swap out fresh water for a larger quantity of treated wastewater. The challenge with these business models, while it is very promising and can be successful, is the contracting mechanisms. Oftentimes, water rights are not clear, and so the contracting agreement oftentimes results in one party reneging on the terms of the contract. But there's great potential, as we've seen in areas where there is significant water scarcity. As I noted, when we talk about wastewater, we often think about sewer connections, sewer-connected areas, because that is the case in many developed countries. But in developing countries, we have to think about fecal sludge. And we have done an extensive analysis, global assessment of cases that some are pilot level, but also commercial cases that have shown to be successful, so that we're not dealing with the issue with the image on your upper left. So there are some examples, commercial entities in Ghana, in Eastern Africa, and also new cases in South Asia where we're converting fecal sludge to an organic fertilizer. And one of the first commercial plants in West Africa was established through a collaboration with IMI and the municipalities. Here, essentially, we're not only looking at how we can treat waste and harness the nutrients from the waste and provide benefits to the agricultural sector. What we're trying to do is to actually, by integrating circular economy principles, we're trying to reverse the economics in the sanitation sector, where typically you would have truck operators empty your septic tanks and they would pay tipping fees to the entity that treats the waste. However, if we're now treating fecal sludge as a waste resource, as an input, the chalk operators that take the sludge and that are paying tipping fees no longer have to pay those fees, because if we're able to reverse the economics, they're not able to sell it as an input to the person that actually converts the waste into an organic fertilizer. And so we're seeing that, circular economy principles are not just creating benefits for the agricultural sector, but we're able actually to reverse the way that the sanitation sector works and ensure that it is sustainable. These models vary from scale. Some of them can be small or large scale, and of course, generating significant benefits to the informal sector, again, if we find ways to integrate them into the sector. So in concluding, circular economy principles are great and we have great conversations, but it's really about how do we make these amazing technologies that have been developed actually work in the developing country context. And while there has been some traction, we still need to work on our enabling environment, looking at the benefits that it produces, but also viewing it from a business lens, and looking at what really works and thinking beyond just cost recovery. And again, when we talk about water, think beyond irrigation, but also looking at different value propositions that can generate more economic benefits. And giving significant consideration to business models around water trading and understanding what the water right mechanisms and what enabling environment is required. So the cases that I spoke about is in a recent publication, and it is open access and available online. I'm happy to answer any questions thereafter. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam, for demonstrating these real challenges that are related to implementation of circular economy solutions in low-income countries. Our next speaker, Philippa Roberts. She's a managing director in the award-winning company called Lo and Behold since 2006. And her company has worked, for example, on a number of anaerobic digestion projects with communities and the food and farming industry. Philippa has been working in the practical reuse and recycling projects for nearly 20 years. Please welcome Philippa Roberts.
So we've said that water is the natural cycle. It's intuitively, you think it's the one thing that we could use as a tool to explain the circular economy to people. My 5-year-old son can tell me how the water comes out of the taps, and it goes through the sea, and there's clouds, and it evaporates, and it rains, and it's this wonderful, very intuitive thing. And yet, in the industry, perhaps we're not quite there, and maybe perhaps that's because we do have a tendency to think in our silos. So when we talk about strategies in an urban environment and what's less natural than an urban environment, there are some things that we really need to consider. We're here to talk about the circular economy and scaling up and water, but there is so much more to the water industry and the way our water systems work than just water. So there's the energy that's used in the processes to clean our water, to clean our wastewater. There's the water itself, we've already talked about this. There are the materials that we use to clean up the water that water is used to transport. There's data. There's a huge amount of data out there. We work with water companies that say, we have huge quantities of data and we're not quite sure what to do with it, but we think it's important, but we don't know why. There's knowledge. There's the sharing of knowledge. It's why we're all here today, to learn from each other, and this is another resource that needs to flow if we're to be successful. And there's money. Money itself is one of the resources that needs to flow if a circular economy is to truly work. Now, context is everything. Context is all important. We've heard about some of the different situations already. So I'm from the UK, and in the UK, we have an industry that privatised in the 80s. So in Scotland and Northern Ireland, we still have state-owned water companies, but in England and Wales, those water companies were privatised. which has created an interesting set of issues. Apart from one company, Welsh Water, which interestingly was bought out by 2 of the staff of the previous private company and turned not for profit. So Welsh Water is now a non-profit distributing company. I'm one of the consumer representatives, a part of the governance structure there. So we have this interesting mix of different entities, but we are still within a highly regulated environment. We have it, and the regulation is enforced. There is a lot of legislation there, common across the EU. And because of this environment, we have a lot of existing infrastructure. So when we talk about doing dramatic circular economy things, you have to remember that Liverpool and London's sewer network is 150 years old. I mean, it's crazy, isn't it, that a city like London is still running on the same sewer network that was built in the 1860s. And so within this regulated, enforced environment of a lot of existing infrastructure, how are we to bring about that change? And if we're to think about change, and it needs to be probably financially viable, as we've just been hearing, you have to make a business case for some of this change. You have to understand where the value is. And the value depends on your perspective and which stakeholder you're talking about. So the cost of water to me as a consumer within an urban area will be one amount. If I have a business and I'm running a factory, the cost of that same water in the same area will cost me something different. And if I was a farmer on the outskirts producing food for the residents of that city to consume, it would cost me something different again. But we're talking about the same commodity in the same area. In the same way, the cost of pollution is different. If I were a consumer and I were to pollute the watercourse or put the wrong thing down my toilet, as happens so often. We have this thing in the UK at the moment about stop the block, because we have lots of issues of fatbergs and things like that. And I heard this wonderful example of a water company doing door-to-door work and going to an old house. There was an old lady in there and saying, obviously you don't put anything other than, what do you do with your food waste that doesn't go down the sink or anything like that? And she said, oh no, I put the cabbage leaves in the toilet because they block my plug hole. Wonderful, the lack of engagement we have. But as a householder, if you do something like that, there's probably very little penalty. If I was a factory and I discharged my textile dye effluent into a watercourse, I would be penalised financially. It would be a very, very expensive thing to do. But in the UK, if I'm a farmer and I let my dairy herd graze at a watercourse, and the effluent is polluting the watercourse, I will be paid to stop that. No polluter pays principle. The water companies will give me grants to put in better fencing and stop it. So again, the value and the cost is so different for different stakeholders in different areas. And we have different perspectives, and I won't really dwell on this, but water has already been discussed. It's a carrier of nutrients, of chemicals, of minerals. We commonly think of it as a service. It's something we consume. It's used in production processes. But where you are depends, and the strategies you have depends on whether your city is in an arid plain or if you're at the top of a wet highland. Are you talking about a human-managed system, a nature-managed system? So we have this current linear model. This diagram comes from a white paper on water that was put out by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation in partnership with Arup and the Antea Group, and I was part of the working group on this, and we were trying to think about all these questions around the value of water and how we communicate something that's so basic and so intuitive, and yet we're not quite getting that message across. And you'll see on here, there's a number of different inputs. They're material, they're kinetic, they're thermal, and a number of different points in a linear system where you can pull out value. There are all these opportunities. And so how well are we doing? How many of these are we using? So an example, first of all, anaerobic digestion, we use it to process sewage sludge, and we also use it to process food waste. Because of different directives and the policy environment we're in the UK, it's very difficult to co-digest food waste in an anaerobic digester that works on sewage sludge, partly because of the different setups. A municipality might run the AD for the food waste and a private company might run the AD for the sewage sludge, but also because of the different directives of spreading and how we've transposed those directives. So 2 different sets of legislation, so people don't do it. So we end up with a situation where, for example, in Cardiff, there's an advanced anaerobic digestion digester co-located next to a food waste digester. Not an efficient use of resources. We worked on a project with a small water company called Albion Water, where there was a new build development and they tried a different approach. So we fitted food waste disposers in the kitchen sinks of every new build house as it went up. So 700 houses, 350 new build, with their own discrete small treatment works. And we did lots of testing. It was one of 3 live pilot sites in the UK for a project I ran for the local government association, looking at the impact of food waste disposers on the sewers. And we found that actually in the new build sites where the sewers are new, adding food waste into the sewer system had no negative impact. If you had an issue in your sewer already, it was going to exacerbate it. It would make it worse. But in the new sewers, there was no negative impact, and it meant that we didn't have to drive bin lorries to collect the food waste around that area. Albion Water has actually also taken responsibility for the green space in this community, the verges, because they want to see if they can add extra green material into the process to increase that biogas yield. So it's an interesting example of taking a more systemic approach, of working in partnership. It only worked because the housing developers were prepared to fit the food waste disposers at no extra cost, because the cost is marginal when you're building a house. And it only worked because the local authority was part of the partnership and said, yeah, we won't collect food waste in this area. We'll let you see what happens if we put it down the sewer network instead and don't use the cars. Yorkshire Water has a large treatment works at a place called Esholt, and although this isn't an urban area, they hope to create an urban area around it. So they're using the wastewater treatment works as a catalyst for bringing in innovative new industries. Say, come on, what can you do? What can you do with this wastewater? What sort of things can you extract from it? What value can you find? There'll be an advanced energy plant. And they're also trying to bring in homes and create a sustainable transport network. So they're looking at the area holistically and putting their wastewater treatment works at the heart of it. Welsh Water, being a non-profit distributing company, has taken a different approach when it comes to social outcomes. So they now, when they're moving into some of the more deprived areas to do big capital works, are sending teams out into the local schools. So when they're talking about turning the tap off when you're cleaning your teeth, they're trying to educate these communities about the importance of good dental health and actually cleaning your teeth, because their staff are there anyway. The marginal cost for them doing a little bit of health education is so small when they're there already, and they want to put this back into the communities. In the same way, as a water company, they're one of the largest employers in Wales, so when, again, they're specifically targeting their apprenticeship schemes in these areas where unemployment might be higher or skills and training might be lower. So, you can think bigger. It doesn't just have to be about the water. Think in partnership. Think about the health bodies that you work with, the schools, the communities, because the circular economy in water is about more than just the water. But in a regulated environment like this, how does government keep up? Being from the UK, our government doesn't really keep up with very much at the moment. Frankly, it's a mystery from day to day what's going to be going on. But we're in this highly regulated environment, and so policy is important. In the UK, we have a Conservative government at the moment, and they have opened up the business side of the water market, water retail to businesses. It's been opened up to competition. They've opened a market in sewage sludge, so we're seeing more innovation coming in now that actually the sewage sludge is just not the property of just the water companies. So you're seeing innovation coming in that area. And yet, on the other extreme, the Labour Party has a policy of nationalisation if they were to come to power, which frankly right now, could be a possibility tomorrow, who knows? And that's because the flows of money haven't worked well. We're in a situation where a city like London, with its very old sewage system, has not invested in replacing it, and Thames Water has been all over the press for the large amount of money it's taken out of the company, but also out of the country in dividend payments, and then has turned around to the state to say, actually, we need some subsidies to build a very creaking infrastructure. So that money hasn't circulated, and what's happened is that politically, we now have the two main parties at polar extremes in terms of what they want to do with the industry. How does government keep up on this? Because of the regulation as well, the water companies are only allowed to set their pricing based on a business plan they put forward to Ofwat, the regulator. So they have to say, in the next 5 years, this is the money I want to spend and this is why, and therefore this is how much I will charge the householder. In that environment, how do you turn around as a water company and say, I want to radically disrupt what I'm doing. I want to go big and circular. I want health outcomes. I want to help local employment. Because we've created this silo, the regulator will just turn around and go, no, we're not going to sign off your business plan. So policy becomes very important in this environment, which means that I'll leave you with this kind of final thought. So if we're going to go circular, you can think big. It could be disruptive. It could be really innovative. It could be really small. It could just be about sorting out your vehicle movements. All water companies have these buildings, and we heard earlier, about the embedded energy in these buildings that they don't think about. They have these land banks that they don't necessarily use well. There's all these small things, or you could think really big, but in such a regulated, enforced environment, how much real systemic change are we going to get? And when I go and talk to water companies and we do workshops about, circular economy strategies, and I quite often put forward the challenge, what would happen if somebody else came and took a slice of your market? And there's always this, well, that's not going to happen, we own the pipes. Right? Yeah, but what if it wasn't in pipes? Already there are companies that have solar technology that will take the water out of the air from the humidity and give you clean drinking water. Already there are companies out there that are trying to pull pharmaceuticals back out of our sewage waste, and that's highly valuable stuff. And I kind of think, you look at the economic history, the way that we develop, and maybe out there will be an Uber or an Airbnb that will come along and go, so what if you've got this sunk capital? So what if you've got this existing infrastructure? All you're doing is tweaking around the edges. And so I look forward to finding and hearing about those challenges, because maybe that's the only way we kind of shake things up and get that change that we need. Thank you.
Thank you, Philippa. It was really, really inspiring speech, and you gave us a lot of things to think about, how the differences need to be taken into account in several aspects. But I think there is still some hope, even though sometimes the directives seem to be a little bit tricky to implement in different countries. Anyway, our next speaker is Dr. Suvi Sojamo. She's a postdoc researcher at Aalto University in Water and Environmental Engineering Group. And Aalto is a multidisciplinary community in the fields of technology, science, business, and art and design. And Suvi has been spending the last 10 years in researching and developing principles and practices for sustainable water use and corporate water stewardship in Finland and internationally. Suvi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Riku, and very good afternoon, everyone. I'm truly honored to have this opportunity to join such distinguished line of speakers and audience today. As said, I've spent the last 10 years researching and developing principles and practices of sustainable water use, and more specifically, corporate water stewardship. And in my view, during that time, water stewardship has emerged as an equally strong buzzword, even if not a paradigm, as has circular economy, especially when we are discussing business engagement on water. And when we are discussing building a fair circular economy for water, a real transformation in the way water is used, managed, and governed, I think there are very important lessons to be learned from water stewardship experience, so that we don't reinvent wheels, especially the broken ones. To start with, what exactly do I mean with water stewardship? Its most recent definition comes from Alliance for Water Stewardship and their newly updated International Water Stewardship Standard. According to it, water stewardship is defined as the use of water that is socially and culturally equitable, environmentally sustainable, and economically beneficial, achieved through a stakeholder-inclusive process that involves site and catchment-based actions. I trust that there are no objections of applying the same definition for water use in circular economy as well. How to get to that state then? There are 4 more specific lessons that I'd like to highlight and which I will elaborate on in more detail. Firstly, circular economy for water needs to reach beyond cities, basins and borders into global value chains. Second, the business case for corporate engagement in water builds on responsibility, risks and opportunities. Third, when looked more closer, circular economy and water stewardship are a mutually complementary match. And fourth and finally, while we are still identifying and developing right policies and regulations, we need research-based frameworks to accelerate action in public interest. All right, first lesson. It basically underlines that internal measures are rarely enough for tackling water challenges, regardless whether we are discussing cities, countries, basins, or companies. And we really need to, regardless whether we are discussing corporate water stewardship or circular economy, we really need to look into global value chains that were also discussed earlier today, as they are really important structures for water use management and governance. So it's not only the traditional water use infrastructure we need to be paying attention to, it's also the broader structures where water is used, managed and governed that we need to be paying attention to. And Finland provides an illustrative example in this regard. If we look at the blue water footprint of our consumption, that is the total amount of surface and groundwater consumed by us annually. Actually, 77% of that footprint lies abroad, despite our water abundance. And that footprint is also left in areas that are water scarce and that are suffering from different kinds of other water-related problems. That said, we need to understand the whole life cycles and global interdependencies of our consumption and production, also when it comes to water. The second lesson relates to the drivers for business engagement in water. There's a lot of talk about the need to engage the businesses more in solving water challenges, contributing towards SDGs. At the moment, it's not happening at a pace needed. As this rather blunt quote from CDP Water that collects water disclosure data for investors puts it. Currently, corporate action is insufficient to achieve SDG 6 and deliver water secure future. At the same time, companies of different sorts and sizes are the major water users internationally, and that results in responsibility. That's a very strong reason for a business case for the increased engagement and understanding of water. In addition, water risks and opportunities are other important drivers. And they are usually classified to physical risks and opportunities that might be related to water availability, water quantity, water quality. They might be related to reputation, as the way water is approached and dealt with affects company reputation and markets. They might be regulatory, as too weak, non-functioning regulation hampers the operating environment for companies and stakeholders alike, whereas fit-for-purpose regulation, that has also been the flavor of today, really levels the playing field and players as well, and ensures sustainable practices by all. Ultimately, all these risks and opportunities materialize as financial risks and opportunities, which are related to both investments and profit. Thirdly, circular economy and water stewardship are, as said, a mutually complementary match. There are lessons to be learned both ways. What I believe circular economy has to offer for current water stewardship practice is taking water smart business models from the start, really understanding water at the strategic level. Because some water stewardship initiatives and projects to date haven't, for example, really considered the actual justification for their water use in the first place, and thus they are not really addressing the underlying fundamental sustainability issues. The other way around, water stewardship has plenty of guidelines available for governance and policy engagement with integrity. When we are discussing engaging businesses more, it also means engaging businesses in policy making, in developing governance platforms. But while you are operating there, you need to be very wary of resource, institutional, and policy capture. Another stream of work that I'd like to also highlight under water stewardship is context-based water targets. As it has been mentioned, context really matters for water much more than it does, for example, for carbon. In some cases, water efficiency or water neutrality are not necessarily even desirable, but sustainable water balances. Sometimes granting access to safe water and sanitation or preserving important water-related areas and ecosystems might be more important than efficiency. So we need to be able to identify the right areas where to act and meaningful shares and targets for each actor. The last lesson relates to the overall facilitation and transformation of the acceleration of the transformation needed. As it has been agreed and emphasized, we are really facing a need for major policy and regulatory changes. How do we get there? In my view, research helps in that. We need to have evidence-based policy making. We need to bring different parties together. I've had the privilege to develop Finnish water stewardship commitment with Finnish research institutes, ministries, and WWF. It essentially is a challenge and a framework for Finnish companies to assess their water risks and to develop sustainable water use and governance throughout the international value chains. It brings together the best guidelines and best practices for different steps of water stewardship progression. The commitment is part of society's commitment of sustainable development, our national implementation framework for Agenda 2030. It's also listed in our newest circular economy roadmap with its aim to make the Finnish companies the most responsible water stewards in the world by 2030. So you are most welcome to join us on that mission or challenge us. I thank you for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to discussion and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Suvi, for matching water stewardship and circular economy in one presentation. Our last speaker is Noran Sadik. She's an analyst in World Bank Global Practice, which is providing large-scale financing and promoting sustainable water and sanitation solutions by helping countries to strengthen capacity and institutions, service delivery, and water resources management. Recently, Noran has focused on investigating the role of policy, institutional, and regulatory incentives in the design and implementation of water sector reforms. Please welcome to the platform, Noran.
Great, so I'm going to jump right in. So there are a lot of really exciting opportunities that are currently happening in the moment that show that we are heading towards the right direction in terms of sustainability. For example, within the water sector, there is a lot of stuff happening with regards to technology. This is a picture of an example of a wastewater resource recovery facility in South Africa that came into operation as of last year. And it's operating at 30% less energy, 30% less cost, and at less waste. Businesses are also re-strategizing to incorporate sustainable practices and building sustainable business models. The use of now the concept of the triple bottom line is not a new concept, but a lot of companies are now using that. They want to measure not only profit, but economic and, financial, social, and environmental benefits. The finance market has increased by 26% in 2018 alone and is now valued at $247 billion. And finally, with the SDGs, you have an investment. It's expected that economies around the world are supposed to be investing $112 billion annually in order to achieve SDG 6. Now, this is mainly obviously targeted at lower middle-income countries in the developing world. And this gives governments really an opportunity to kind of pause for a minute and re-strategize and come up with new innovative ways in order to use public finances a lot more efficiently. However, there are a lot of problems. Do not worry, I'm not going to go through this whole list, but I will focus on the key main points which are highlighted up there. The first is the use of subsidies. It's been mentioned time and time again, and it's even been mentioned in today's session. It's estimated that $345 billion are spent annually at a global level just on water and sanitation subsidies alone. Obviously, this means that prices currently with the current model, the linear model, are artificially low, and so that disincentivizes anyone to move into more currently expensive approaches, which is going through with the circular economy approaches. Another issue is the negative public perception of wastewater reuse and wastewater products. This is a problem because obviously you need to create that demand. You need to get people to perceive reused products as something good, as something that they want to be a part of. So obviously without the demand, you're not going to really get much action happening there. Another issue, it's been mentioned time and time again as well, is poor coordination. And unfortunately with the water sector, it's quite heavily fragmented horizontally, so between different levels of government, so from national to municipal levels, where the national government is expected to set the strategy, set the policy, set the targets, for example, and the municipalities are expected to implement. But also horizontally across the different sectors that should be key stakeholders and players when it comes to a circular economy, which are, for example, energy, health, environment. And interestingly as well, even within the water sector itself, there is in often cases there is a lack of coordination between the water supply and service delivery units and the water resource management units. So it's really about trying to get these actors to sit together on the same table. Lastly, and something that's also very common, is regulatory standards. Philippa mentioned it in her presentation and others as well. It's a real issue, is how do we update policies and regulations to ensure that they enable innovative approaches. It's now often the case that you'll find either restrictive policies because of the high health risks associated with wastewater reuse products. Governments can be slightly more risk averse and just they prefer not to deal with these issues. And they can also be inconsistent. So, like we've said before, with the wastewater reuse, you need to be able to work across energy, health and environment and so on. And without having a complete regulatory framework, not much can be done. But there is hope. And for a number of case studies, which I'll be showing you shortly, a small step into moving into the right direction that can help incentivize governments, give governments hope, and to kind of also what's really important to bring government on board is a political incentive, is to focus on improving resource efficiency of your current assets. And why that matters is because as soon as you start achieving quick wins, it's easier to get people on board and it's easier to get people invested to start really implementing those changes. Because as of now, you'll often hear that we know what to do, we've heard these key messages time and time again, but nothing is being done. So some of the things most of these are related to updating technical guidelines, so they're quite cost-effective measures in terms of regulation and policies. And it's a matter of updating technical guidelines, because you'll often find as well, when working with different governments, you might find that the regulation is slightly outdated. The first might sound like common sense, but the first issue is understanding the demand side. So understanding the purpose of why you're treating this wastewater, understanding the characteristics of the influent and so on, and designing technologies that are aligned with that demand. This is a key issue. Another thing is setting reasonable targets. So it's often the case that government sets certain targets and they're not aligned with the capacity to implement, nor the technical capacity or financial capacity. So it ends up not being, the targets don't end up being achieved. So it's often better to start off slow and to set realistic targets that can be achieved. Another issue is setting adequate treatment technologies. There seems to be a bias towards more centralized, expensive technologies in a lot of cases. And that's an issue, one, in terms of expenses. They're usually the most expensive technologies, and they don't operate at full capacity, which is even at a loss. But another issue is equity. You often find, and this is the biggest challenge, especially when it comes to SDG 6, the biggest challenge now is actually connecting the rural communities and the peri-urban communities that can't be networked. We need to start thinking of different ways and different non-network technologies in order to connect these people too, because they have the right to healthier lives and better environments. Another issue, relatedly, is determining the scale of treatment systems. So a lot of the guidelines are using very outdated technologies, whereas today we have a lot of knowledge, there's a lot of data, there's a lot of mathematical modeling that can be used in order to determine appropriate scales without financial losses. Another issue is using maximum capacity of your existing infrastructure. This is a common issue that we see globally. And in a lot of cases, people oversee, so you might think that you need to invest in an entirely new, for example, wastewater resource reuse facility, but you can actually make smaller capital investments in existing wastewater treatment plants that can scale it up into something different and make most use of your current assets. And there's actually an interesting example of that in Argentina and Buenos Aires, where the main utility there, it was expected to invest in new infrastructure, and that amounted to $150 million. However, they carried out an asset inventory, they figured out how much their maximum capacity is and their potential capacity is, and now they're working on using those assets to the most efficient level possible. And of course, finally, another issue is reducing energy consumption. Energy consumption remains to be a big component of operational costs of wastewater treatment plants. It accounts for 10 to 30% of operational costs. So there's also other more profit maximizing ways or investments that you could use or incorporate within existing capital to make them more energy efficient. But of course, it doesn't make sense to try and boost efficiency and productivity efficiency of your assets and to make sure you're getting as much resources as possible, whether it's in terms of water, biomass, or energy, without actually creating the demand and creating the markets that would facilitate the function of these products. So the first issue comes with the water market. And so through a number of case studies, we're finding that it's often quite profitable for the utilities to focus on, as their target market initially, to focus on their industrial clients. And that helps them either at least reduce their operation and maintenance costs or to cover them fully. Another issue, though, relatedly, is it depends on if your target market is in agriculture, for example. Subsidies will be needed in that case because it could be the case that using fresh water still ends up being slightly cheaper than using the reused water. Energy market, again, similarly to water, the energy produced can be used to reduce operational costs and reduce the energy use of the power plant facility itself, or it could be an extra revenue stream for the utility. The biggest issue we have is with the biosolids market, and that again is related to the high risks because of the health environmental risks associated with it, but also there's an issue with willingness to pay. A lot of the agricultural consumers, they don't feel like they should be paying for something like this. But there are a number of cases, which I will share with you, that are making these steps in the right direction and that are implementing some of these measures. And the first one is in Mexico. And this was basically a take or pay purchase agreement between the Water Commission and the Energy Commission. And basically what that means is that what's stipulated in the contract is that the Energy Commission is obligated to buy X amount of wastewater, reused water, and if they don't, they pay a penalty. So that guarantees a source of revenue for the wastewater treatment plant, and at the same time, the costs end up cheaper for the thermal power plant. And through this study, we found that it's actually been 33% cheaper than the freshwater alternative that they have. And they've ended up saving $18 million within 6 months. There's better quality of services in terms of regularity, in terms of quality of the water, and even farmers have benefited from agricultural productivity through crop diversification and through planting of more valuable crops. You'll see at the bottom there, so some of the key success factors that really stood out with this arrangement are that regulations were implemented and introduced for wastewater reuse. Stakeholder engagement. Stakeholder engagement was key. They made sure that the agricultural sector was involved, the energy sector was involved through negotiating the contract and raising awareness and education to make sure that they address that demand side. This is a case in Durban in South Africa. It was a 20-year concession contract. And this contract was interesting because actually, so the technologies that were created or implemented were actually tailored to the two key industries, but at the same time it was made sure that they can be reused after the 20-year contract is done. Again, they're paying up to 50% less cheaper for their water resources. They also have risk mitigation measures within their contract. The recycling plant is getting their regular source of revenue. And also, in terms of the community themselves, fresh water resources were freed up for 400,000 people. There's 10% less wastewater discharges into the ocean. And also postponed investments in terms of new infrastructure. They weren't really necessary during that specific time period anymore, and they were postponed. And lastly, Egypt. That's where I'm originally from. And this was the first PPP project to be implemented in Egypt. And so in order to make sure that the governance mechanisms flow well and work well, they established a PPP unit within the Ministry of Finance. They made sure that it had people of the highest caliber. They made sure they had external advisors to make sure that they were gaining lessons learned from best practices. There was a lot of stakeholder engagement and institutional coordination, and that was through the governance committees and oversight that provided oversight and guidance just to make sure that everything was being done on time, to make sure inputs that were needed were received, and so on. And also risks. Obviously, again, risk analysis and allocation was clear, and understanding of roles and responsibility were made clear. So my final slide is on what I'm calling the 3 C's for change. And those are the 3 key things that I think are crucial for governments to start addressing now in order to scale up these project-based successes that we have seen. Getting these changes to happen at a global scale and to start really integrating the water sector within the other sectors and to really push through towards a circular economy, you're going to need to start addressing these issues. One is costs. Yes, water pricing is a key, it's a political issue, often it is. However, it's really, really important to ensure that the market prices reflect externalities of both production and consumption. Relatedly, on that point, by doing that, government funds and through the subsidies that they were spending on previously, the freed up government funds can be used to leverage private sector financing and private capital instead of being spent on subsidies, for example. And it also gives private investors a real signal that we're taking this seriously. It gives them an incentive to start thinking about innovative ways to address this challenge. Because as of today, with the nature of water sector projects and with the nature of water infrastructure, it takes a long time, first of all, to start seeing gains from your research and development investments. It takes maybe up to 20 years to start really seeing revenues coming in. So there really needs to also be a boost in incentives for the private sector to engage. Collaboration is another key issue. I've spoken about that, so I won't go into much detail. And the last thing is really for the government to act as a catalyst for innovation. You don't often hear the word innovation within the water sector practice or within public management of water services. So it's about really pushing government and state actors, regulators, and introducing policies that really foster innovative practices. And thank you. That is it from me for today. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Noran, for giving us hope. Now I would like to invite all the speakers to the podium, where we have some time for a couple of questions from the audience. And here in these questions I have Mr. Ari Kangas from the Ministry of Environment. He will be helping me to read relevant questions from the app, which you have probably all used. So maybe we'll start with a question from the podium. I have also questions, but we'll start with a question from the audience.
Thank you. Yes, I'm coupling several questions. They have more or less same contents. First one comes from the point of water reuse and recirculating of wastewater sludge. What about the hazardous substances, micropollutants, microplastics, whatever there might be? How to tackle with that issue?
Do we have any engineers here? This is a little bit engineering question, I would say.
Well, one of those questions was addressed to Thomas.
Of course, it's also about the public perception.
Okay.
Who would like to take this question? Maybe Thomas starts.
Since it seemed that I was addressed by that question. I mean, it's clear. It goes back to the dual question that I placed regarding direct versus indirect reuse. No? If we think about direct reuse, that means if human consumption is in the middle, then obviously those pollutants have to be out of the water, and we have to consider the cost of that treatment before we analyze the whole rest of the story. But the problem is sometimes the precaution that we have in order to make people feel safer regarding the level of treatment that water has to have before you can actually use it again. For example, for cleaning the streets in your city, microplastics are a problem, but I don't think that those microplastics returned on the streets in the city pose a major problem, okay? So we can overdo things. Then if we look at the developed, underdeveloped world, you will see that people get by with some water qualities that we would not even accept in the developed world. So these are very, very relative things. So essentially we have to think about if we want to go into direct reuse, we have to treat up to drinking water standards, and we know what those are, and we know what those take. And if not, then we have to take a compromise, label the pipes accordingly, and treat this water separately at another price.
So you are saying that the context matters, but
Absolutely.
we also need to take into account the regulatory framework, which is kind of would support the idea of circular economy. But isn't it a little bit a sensitive area if we are setting more loose standards for the areas where there are other major risks compared to some other regions where, for example, spreading sewage sludge to the farmland might be a little bit higher risk than in the other fields? What do you think? Is it okay to have different level of regulation in different parts of the world? Miriam?
I think that it's important for us to, of course, look at the context and ensure that we're contextualizing our solutions. But I think in terms of safety, whether it's human health or if it's the environment, where we're seeing in the long term, accumulation of certain pollutants, then it's important that we have very clear guidelines. And again, matching it to the specific uses. Once we're aware of what uses we're using the treated wastewater for, then we can assess and make sure that we have our guidelines tailored to that. To add to that, I think that, while we're talking about policy and there's a significant role for government to play, there's still a lot of research that we need to do. And I think this goes to the universities, but also research institutes. And I think that it's work in progress, but it's really important that while we're talking about all that government needs to do, building capacity is really critical. And that while we're increasing investments in implementation, it's important that we not forget to increase our investments in research and building capacity of those engaged in the sector, to ensure that, we're not solving one problem by creating another one.
Yeah, correct. Ari, you have some more? I think we were not exactly answering the question, but I think it's a little bit part of the bigger question that how the regulation is answering to these kind of challenges which we will face in the application.
It answered to some questions concerning the regulation. Then about the size. This is a rather straightforward question about the best, right, viable, how do you define it, size of a decentralized system, but going as decentralized as private
I think
dry toilets
this
or
question
something
is
like
probably
that.
to Philippa, because you've been working with different sizes.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Again, context is everything, isn't it? In the UK, we've seen a move away from a lot of smaller wastewater treatment plants to big mega plants, and we actually now have shut down smaller ones and we tanker sewage sludge into these big plants where there's advanced anaerobic digestion and different energy technologies. So we're driving the stuff there now, and everything is circular, you know, everything goes through a fashion, doesn't it? So I wonder how big we get before we suddenly go, actually, that was totally wrong, and then we'll go back small again. The Albion Water example I talked about, that's one of the things they were looking at there. So it was an old military site, which is why it has a discrete system, which is why it's an interesting test bed. And they're looking to see how small something like anaerobic digestion can be to be financially viable if you bring in other inputs like food waste, like grass cuttings. And they have an attenuation lake there that takes the storm water for a non-potable water system as well. So they're trying lots of different things in one place, which is a really good way of trialing, I think, instead of sitting in our silos. So taking different things that are managed by different people to see if it becomes viable if you're not just looking at it from a sewage sludge point of view. So there's no one answer, is there? The context is so important.
One size doesn't fit all, Tom.
I think the answer to the question is there is no correct or single answer. Depends on the context, absolutely, but size matters. The example of La Farfana, which was mentioned also by the World Bank in Santiago de Chile, is an example, and the only one I know. At the time that plant was decided to be built, Chile had only 13% of its sanitary effluents treated. 13%. And it went from 13 to 99% in 13 years. A big city like Santiago de Chile. This is an unheard success story, which has never again been duplicated. So we should also stick with what works. And definitely there is a certain advantage in size, although it's not always applicable. You go to developing countries, you have to go to more decentralized systems for it to work, clearly.
Good. Very good points. Ari, shall you continue?
Maybe one more, once again combined, comes from the operational point. How to tackle the operational problems and wastewater treatment plants in developing countries, assuming that there are ones, and where is the development if we think that there are many nature-based solutions for wastewater treatment?
Who would like to take this one? I think this goes to Miriam.
Take that one?
Yeah, I could, but I'm not sure that I was clear on the question.
How to tackle the operational problems in the...
That's one, and then the use of natural systems.
Natural systems.
Is two.
I think that in terms of tackling and we have to, and again going back to context, to understand that in different developing countries, they're on different trajectories, right? And so in some areas like Haiti, where you don't have a choice but to subsidize the operation and maintenance of their treatment plants because the households simply do not have sufficient income to be charged wastewater treatment fees in order to ensure sustainability of the plants. But in other areas, we have to look beyond provision of subsidies, and see how we can recover those costs. And so in different contexts, we're on different trajectories, and we just have to, again, contextualize it and see what works in the interim and in the long term, and ensure that we're implementing sustainable models from that perspective. In terms of nature-based solutions, there are some that have worked. With the example that I gave with aquaculture production, some of those are nature-based. But again, there are challenges related to health, but also the environment, and which again, I reiterate that there is a significant need for research, because we see the benefits in the short term, but what the implications are going to be long term, whether it's groundwater contamination or whether it's pollutant accumulation in our bodies from consuming wastewater-based aquaculture fish, those are still questions that need to be answered.
Thank you very much. I think now it's time we have also watch there showing 0, which means that we are going to close the session. I'm trying to say a few words about the key elements of our speakers today, just to remind you what we were talking and discussing. And I think the fundamental, the message from Thomas was that the true circular economy cannot be achieved without water in the center, because water is a unique resource underpinning all drivers of growth. Miriam was demonstrating some of the major challenges in low-income countries, such as high dependency on subsidies and limited access to financing, as well as the need for market-driven mechanisms and innovative business models which need to be coupled with the right enabling environment. In the beginning of this session, I mentioned an engineering list in circular economy for water, material and energy, and Philippa added 3 more: data, knowledge and money. She also demonstrated how there's a long way to go before, a lot of barriers to overcome before creative destruction can change conventional linear take, use, discharge approach to real circular economy. Suvi was demonstrating how circular economy and water stewardship are a complementary match, how circular economy for water needs to be beyond cities, basins and borders into global value chains, and how business case for corporate engagement builds on responsibility, risks and opportunities. Noren continued by emphasizing the importance of enablers and risk management. Technology and innovation cannot make change alone, and if we want to implement water reuse and resource recovery projects, there is a strong need for policy, institutional and regulatory incentives which would set the enabling environment, establish suitable institutions and create functioning operational environment. We remember 3 C's: costs, collaboration and catalyze. And I would like to conclude this session by referring to WSSTP's vision, which shortly tells us what is needed. We need to redesign our water infrastructure for multiple waters, for multiple purposes and users. This redesign is no more linear. It's not only about water use, it's about considering water as water, material and energy, or in other words, like in the other report, as a service, as a carrier, or as a source of energy. However, this will not happen overnight. That's why we need to start right now. Thank you.